Oliver, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, be a good time. I guess before we jump into anything, just to kind of set the table for people watching or listening, can you just get into, I guess, just how you got into the discourse and how you like, or when you got into the discourse as well, and maybe a little bit about your recent interests and what you've been up to lately.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, my entry into the discourse was very gradual. Like some other writers, I was somebody who my whole life I've basically like commented on internet message boards and things like that. Kind of been like a troll to a
Did you
certain
have a
extent.
favorite growing up,
A favorite
like a
message board
forum, yeah, or
growing up.
anything?
The first wasn't a message board, but the first place that I ever argued about like religion and politics online was the Internet Chess Club.
Okay.
So it was you would go there to play chess, but then it had a religion channel and a politics channel. And I found myself, and I was like 10 years old and I was arguing with like 50-year-olds. But it wasn't weird because it's also like you're also like a 10-year-old playing chess against 50-year-olds. So it didn't seem weird to me, but it started to seem weird to them.
Was that
It did.
around like the new atheist movement? Was there like a kind of convergence there?
Yeah, I think maybe I was like an early new atheist. I mean, I was raised atheist.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so yeah, basically, when I was like maybe 10 or 12 years old, I was very certain that like atheist epistemology was correct and would contravene any religious claim or anything like that. Um, and I don't know if I necessarily abandoned those beliefs explicitly. I guess sometimes you don't know if you were actually convinced that one of your beliefs is wrong, or if you kind of like gotten tired of it to a certain extent.
Right.
You're just like, I don't really want to be that person
You beat it
anymore.
up in your head. You're like, man,
Yeah,
I'm starting to sound annoying to myself.
yeah, I just want to try, to an extent. And this is something, that I worry about myself because it's something I'm, my speaking of my entry into the recent discourse, right? I started out very much with the mindset that like all this woke stuff, all this social justice stuff is very much just like people, it's like a kind of fashion and it's people believing things in order to kind of see themselves in a certain way, to kind of garb themselves in a certain way. Um, and, then you reflect for a minute or two, which, could take a minute or two or it could take a year for that process, as it did for me. And you realize that like actually like to a certain extent like the anti-woke stuff is also kind of a certain kind of garb, right? It feels nice to be a heretic, it feels nice to be edgy and things like that. um and so basically of my own beliefs, I don't know which ones I have because I was convinced of them and which ones I have because they seemed like the next fashionable thing or the next iteration of my personality or something like that.
Well, it's tricky because it's not, like, just based on your writing and how I've only been following you for maybe a year or so, but I kind of I gather we have a similar impulse. I don't want to say it's like a core tenet of our thinking or anything like that, but it's definitely I gather that you have a more contrarian mindset, like just like temperamentally, and I do too. So like growing up, I grew up more in a religious household, religious community, and I rebelled in like when I was like 14 for the first time, and
Yeah.
I started going through the whole like not necessarily this is all BS, but started to deconstruct it like this sort of format of religion is BS and questioning all that, and it had a not a similar path to you per se, but like similar impulses where then along the way I started to pick up on these trends where it was like get into new atheism and then like catch a moment where I'm like, man, is this all just an aesthetic? Like, do we actually believe these things? Same with social justice. It's like
Right.
impulse is like, man, is this an aesthetic or like what is the underlying belief here? And it's like almost like a knee jerk for me at least. It's a knee jerk
Right.
feeling where I'm like, I see people posture online or I see people kind of like set out a premise and then work backwards essentially from
Right. Yeah.
you know what I mean? It's like it's kind of like they reverse engineer a lot of their beliefs, and that's always bothered me. But maybe in part due to my own projection. I guess I've always done that to a certain extent growing up as well. So that's just me. But is that something like you feel like at that contrarian level? Like is it more of an impulse, and then you kind of work through the impulse, or
Yeah, I think I definitely feel the impulse, and I definitely sometimes I work through the impulse, and sometimes I give in to it. Like, just being real
you're
about
like it's
myself,
right?
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. One example is well, okay, I can put this story in the context of more about like how I got into this discourse specifically. Um, So the first public writing I ever did was on a web magazine called Quillette, which is like the centerpiece really of what's now called the intellectual dark web. Back then, this was in 2017, so it was maybe a year before this name came out. But it had been a place where, you know, no idea is off limits. We're not going to censor anything. We don't want to give in to social justice dogmas. And in fact, a lot of our writing is going to be against social justice dogmas, and at kind of a variety of levels of edginess, right?
Yeah, because they all, even from, I don't want to say the get-go, but they also had a lot of like leftist critiques of social justice as well.
Yeah, so I think Quillette is a site that, yeah, like you said, maybe not from the get-go, but once they realized or started to maybe like intellectually appreciate that those critiques were available, I think basically, and this is something I've written about too, basically everybody in the intellectual dark web, I think at a certain point was like, it would be great to have some of like the anti-woke Marxists, you know, and you know, the Adolf Reed types, like the materialists who think that, you know, who think that wokeness is just kind of symbolic, apolitical woke capital pandering or whatever. I think at a certain point, basically everybody in the anti-woke sphere realized that it would be good to integrate this perspective in. And they've had varying levels of success, right? Even anti-woke leftists often don't want to be like tarred with the brush of like, oh, you published in this place, they also published this thing that's racist or sexist kind of thing.
Right.
So I wrote, the first thing I wrote for them was basically a defense of this philosopher, Rebecca Tuvel, who in 2017 had published in a feminist philosophy journal, Hypatia, an argument that basically went like, you know, first premise is, you know, we should respect the identities of transgender people. Second premise is like, in all the like morally relevant respects, transracial identity, this was in like during the Rachel Dolezal stuff, right? Transracial identity is morally similar to transgender identity, with the conclusion being we should also respect the identities of transracial people who think they're of a different race. And this, I don't know exactly why, to be honest. So this got both transgender people and transgender philosophers and Black philosophers a bit angry, although mostly Black non-philosophers, actually. Black philosophers, I think, were generally rather respectful of it. Some people thought that she was kind of like cleverly trying to make an argument against, you know, what we call a reductio ad absurdum, an argument against transgender identity, which is not what she was going to try to do.
One of those things, like when you see this pieced out in like a Twitter snapshot, everyone just dunks on it without any like initial
exactly,
because it's just on its face value. You're like, this is ridiculous.
Yeah,
I don't want to engage with this.
But that's the funny thing is that it was done by philosophers, right? What we do in philosophy, like how many ridiculous ideas are there in philosophy?
It's all thought experiments.
Yeah, exactly. It's all thought experiments and silly ideas. And you know, there's a famous philosopher now, one of the kind of top people in philosophical metaphysics, in analytic metaphysics, believes that only one thing exists. You know, just like the whole world exists and it can't be subdivided or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, and some people, there are philosophers who think there's no such thing as right and wrong. So there's all sorts of philosophical ideas, and you know, the point of philosophy is to take them seriously, and if they seem ridiculous, you're supposed to feel the pressure to come up with an argument against them.
Right.
What happened with Tuvel's article was very odd, because people were like, here's the obvious counter argument, and it was like something that she had addressed. You know, like all the counter arguments people came up with were things she had addressed in the paper. Anyway, so I wrote all this stuff in an article in 2017, which was a little bit more aggressive than my articles these days are like pretty. I try to be quite. A friend of mine is always calling me measured, which I don't know if I want to be measured exactly.
You add a lot of caveats. You hedge your bets.
Yeah, I like to have disclaimers, and I like to do things at a kind of level of remove where it's like, if you accept this, then you should accept this. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to tell you exactly what to accept. I'm going to tell you more about the implications of the things that you probably already accept.
Right.
Which is, again, you know, the sort of thing that philosophers like to do a lot. So that was how I got into this discourse. I wrote this thing for Quillette. I'd had terrible writer's block for most of my life. I had spent a year in law school and dropped out, and then I did a master's program, and it took like years to finish my papers. And the thing that was addictive about writing this article and other articles for Quillette was just seeing the normal like social media stuff, right? Seeing the likes come in and shares from famous people, the dopamine, you know,
it's addictive.
You know, it's incredibly addictive. You get your followers go up. You know, people talk to you who it's like, why has this person even heard of me? Let alone they're seeking me out.
Right.
And that's also the crazy thing about Twitter, right? And to a lesser extent, Facebook. But it's just like everybody's there for whatever reason. Maybe we shouldn't be. Maybe it's a horrible place. Maybe I have started trying to set a time limit so that I only use Twitter like 15 minutes a day. Maybe I always raise that time limit and always end up using it much more than that, unfortunately.
Good call.
But with regards to the contrarianism thing, the funny thing was, so of course, writing for Quilla, I feel like I am the contrarian, right?
You're automatically there in a way.
Yeah, exactly. We're fighting against the social justice orthodoxy, right? We're fighting against the woke mob, you know, whatever you want to call it, the politically correct.
Right. Which, to be clear, I just want to kind of maybe preface this for people watching or listening that may be coming from, I don't know, like a lens, let's say a more left-leaning lens who might hear something like that and think, well, what do you mean? Like the orthodoxy, like culturally has always been more at a conservative bend or what have you. And I think it is important to kind of frame this in a way where, like, especially from like 2013 to 15, 16-ish, I mean, the sort of cultural norms in the online culture war space really did become dominated by the more social justice left space, whatever we want to call it. And all the critiques of that up to, I guess, the point you're mentioning, like around Quillette, all the critiques up to that point were from essentially far right sources. So it's like there wasn't really a culture war dialogue going on. It was more like there wasn't really a center. It was more like the social justice left kind of emerged through Black Lives Matter, new waves of feminism, Gamergate, etc. And then the whiplash to that was like far right. And then there became this kind of ping pong effect where it was like each side was like, no, you started it type of thing. And Quillette / the IDW, for all its failings, in my view, kind of like attempted to curate a space that was like a liberal center left-ish critique of these things without being completely reactionary, although many would say it had reactionary elements from the onset. But of course that's more the space that you're occupying, just to kind of lay out a little bit of
and also, just to be clear, I always, usually if I say something like woke mob, people who don't know me will not know this, I guess. And probably most people, it's not like many people know me, so most people watching this won't know me. Usually when I say a phrase like woke mob, I'm just doing it in at least a little bit of a self-mocking way, right? Because there is an element of in all of this, and again, this is something that I've realized over the years. There's an element of taking oneself a little bit too seriously, kind of catastrophizing about being attacked online and things like that. That's always been present in the backlash against, internet social justice dynamics, against what was called, nobody really uses this phrase anymore, but 5 years ago, everybody was very concerned about call out culture.
Yep. Oh yeah. People kind of called it outrage culture too, in a way.
And now I think call out culture was a term a bit more for kind of like the internal dynamics of left-leaning spaces online. And now like cancel culture. So outrage culture, I guess, was just people getting angry. And now cancel culture is for when there can actually be like real world repercussions, because now, and that is the sense in which, to the extent that there is an orthodoxy, I think part of it has come from this thing of like, corporations do care, right? Like, if I am just like a lowly barista or something, and I get, there's this old video that I remember from my very, very early days on Twitter. I'm not going to say all the content of it because it was horribly offensive, but the joke of it was this young woman who, like I said, wrote some horribly offensive things, racially offensive things on Twitter, and changed her bio to say, I'm a barista at XYZ coffee shop in like ABC location, right? And so she said these terrible racist things and changed her picture to a picture of somebody else and like photoshopped a Trump hat on them. Wow. And what she did was she did a video of watching all the people tagging this coffee shop that she had claimed to work at. And it was like hundreds of people tagging this place that she had said that she worked at as a joke. But she would have been, I think she genuinely would have been fired. And I think that that's why people call it cancel culture, right? Because you can have genuine material losses from posting something online that's offensive.
Right.
And that, I think, some people say there's no such thing as cancel culture, but that it just seems obviously true that that thing can happen.
Right.
And I think that's all that people mean by cancel culture. They don't really mean anything much more elaborate than that.
Well, people get caught up in the language and how
it's
been, maybe exploited by, again, like Fox News or what have you.
Right.
And then it kind of loses a lot of its meaning. It's like, I think about it in terms of what you just said as an example. I mean, I think about it like, of course, if there's 1,000 people and there's 1,000 people work at 100, different businesses, and they're tweeting 10 times a day, and within those things, it's politicized culture war type stuff. Of course, like probably 80, 90, 95, maybe even 99% of those tweets and those people, they're never going to get in trouble. Their employer's never going to care. It's never going to go anywhere. But it's more so the looming threat that like you as an individual, like you might tweet something, and then that tweet will have repercussions, if not in the moment, 5-10 years down the road. That is the sort of feared thing, like whatever you call it, that leads people to become either self-censoring or fearful of these repercussions in a way where it's not so much like, I'm going to tweet this opinion and then I'm going to get canceled for it. Like you probably won't, but it's just the looming threat will exist.
Yeah, the possibility. And, it's not like it's very unpredictable. When somebody decides to make you famous, it's very unpredictable what's going to happen, right? It's not like there are ground rules about it.
No one decides to be the main character of Twitter.
Yeah, exactly. So the funny, I still had to, I'm saying too much about too many things. So the only reason I brought up Quillette was to talk about this contrarianism thing that we were talking about. And I still like Quillette. I read Quillette a lot. I like Claire, the editor, a lot. I like Jamie, the other editor, a lot, and the other people associated with Quillette. In January of 2019, I went to a Quillette meetup in Toronto, a kind of event. I don't know what it was, like a dinner. I don't know what to call it. It was like a fundraising event.
Mixer type of thing.
Yeah, like a kind of mixer. And my cousin lived in Toronto, so I was going to see him too, so it was convenient. The funny thing about my contrarianism is, like, I get to this thing and everybody there is like a Quillette person, right? And like suddenly I just don't want to be a Quillette person anymore, right? And suddenly everybody and again, nothing against them. This is what always happens in this kind of mixer, right? The dynamic got a little bit self-congratulatory. People started saying, we're all very brave. We're all very this, we're all very that. And suddenly I just I was like, I want to be against these people now for as long as I'm here. And I think that's kind of the shape of my contrarianism, right? Like I can't, for whatever reason, you put me in a group, once the group starts to do something, I'm like against it, right? Once the group starts to coalesce around something, I just feel that I have to be the counterweight. And I think that's obviously in a lot of ways irrational at the individual level. It's irrational just because you happen to be in a room of the 50 people who believe this thing to suddenly decide that it's now the majority belief. But it's just kind of the way that I'm built. And if I'm in a group that's coalescing around a certain viewpoint, I'm going to look for the counter argument, or even, less respectably, just like the way to make fun of it. Right. And that's the way that my contrarianism works. And there's basically no, any group that I feel that I'm perceived as being a part of, I think I'm going to feel that urge. So maybe it's really like I think it's a very juvenile thing that I have, right? It's like a very much like, don't label me, like I'm too cool to be like anybody else. I'm too much of an individual, you know, things like that.
Well, it kind of depends on how you utilize it, right? Because I think
Yeah.
I relate to you completely in this way, and I think just the other night I had a friend over I don't see too often, and we were just chat, longtime friend, like I've known this person for over 15 years,
Mhm.
and we were just chatting about whatever, and they kind of, and I haven't seen this person in a long time. We live close to her, we don't hang out too often, and they brought up this example of something that a friend of theirs had said,
Mhm.
and it just made no sense to me at all. Like logically, there was just no sense behind it at all. There wasn't like a there's two sides to this thing. It just felt completely inconsistent at just the fundamental level. But they
Right.
said it in a kind of nonchalant, like this is just how it is type of thing. And I just started like poking at it and being
Mhm.
like, what do you mean by this? And like, what's an example of this? And wouldn't
Mhm.
you say like this over here kind of contradicts that? And we started talking through it. And as we're going through it, like 10 minutes pass and then 20 minutes pass, and it starts to heat up a little bit.
Yeah, yeah.
And I noticed like they're starting to get uncomfortable. And then I'm starting to get uncomfortable because I'm
Mhm.
like, shit, I didn't mean to make them uncomfortable. Like
Right.
my goal in this was like I wanted to tease out. I'm like, I'm not even arguing because this thing matters really.
Mhm.
I'm more so just honestly trying to figure out like what is their thought process
Right,
behind
yeah.
this, like when it's gonna break down. And they weren't cracking. So I was
Mhm.
like, it didn't feel right to just let it go and be like, I'm over this, because they just wouldn't.
Right.
Like I said, it wasn't a type of thing where you can just be like, well, on this side, we believe this. It wasn't like a moral judgment type of thing.
Mhm.
Anyway, so afterward, we hugged it out. Like he even brought up to me, he was like, do you do this for fun often? Because like I don't talk to him as much anymore. And I'm like, yeah, like I'm online all the time. Like it's
Yeah, yeah. It's
kind
what
of
we do online,
unhealthy.
yeah.
Yeah, and like it really got me reflecting afterward. I was like, man, like I was a total asshole, and like I didn't think in the moment that I was
Mhm.
coming across like an asshole. It just it hit me afterwards. I was like, man, most people in like regular life, whatever, just aren't. They don't want to do that. They aren't accustomed to doing
No.
that. But in what you do, particularly like both in academia and then in the sort of online culture war space, there is a sort of place for that. I think, like we said before, the thought experiment example, like where you can tease
Yeah.
out some of these like boundaries, when you do come across a new group think, it's like what is the best critique of this group think, and kind of break it down. And then for me, at least personally, sometimes I'll break that down and then get to the bottom and be like, okay, well, I still believe this, or like I'm
Right,
comfortable
yeah.
associating with people like this or whatever. And then that is what it is. But in the moment, I think that exercise can be beneficial, or it can make you look like an asshole, just depending on who's watching or who you're around.
Yeah. I'm gonna turn my light on 1 sec.
Oh, no, sure. This is not sponsored by Flex Seal. They sent me this mug for free.
That should be better. I noticed I was looking a
No,
little weird on
sun,
camera.
sun starts setting it. I
Yeah,
noticed
yeah.
in my
Um,
show.
yeah, so I would say, yeah, so it's completely true that in my academic work, what I was going to say early on when you were describing this interaction, I was thinking basically like, this is why they killed Socrates, right? Like, it was just so annoying to people because he just kept poking at people would say
Yeah.
like, oh, you should do this. It's the pious thing to do. And then he would be like, well, what do you mean by pious? And then he'd be like, rah, rah, rah. I think that there are a few things that I try to remember that kind of moderate this urge in me. Or a few things that I try to do. So one thing is like just that, over thousands of years of trying to be true to what Socrates was looking for in the way that we use language, like we've never been successful, right?
Right.
And one of my recent pieces about defining critical race theory is basically along these lines, where it's kind of like, this is basically, so Ludwig Wittgenstein is a philosopher who's basically known for emphasizing this exact point, right? There's almost no concept that we use that we can really give a completely rigorous definition of. Concept in mathematics are stipulated, so we can do that for mathematics. But think about even like the, is a hot dog a sandwich kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Everybody can competently use the phrase hot dog, the phrase hot dog and the word sandwich, right? But somehow being a competent user of English doesn't necessitate a conclusion on whether a hot dog is a sandwich.
Right.
So I think there's a point at which you have to make sure that you're not asking for too much from somebody. Where if there are genuine cases where you want to be like, is this a case? One place where it's important is, so for example, in the critical race theory legislation, of course, it makes complete sense to be like, will this legislation make this thing illegal or not?
Right.
Right. That's just a question. You have to know that to know whether you want to support the law, right? Because you have to know what the effects of the law is going to be. So there are places where you really do have to get to the bottom of a definition, but there are other places where you can kind of be like, okay, that's a little fuzzy, but I get the thrust of it, right? I get what it's kind of about. I get what you relate to this definition.
Like terms like grifter or weaponized, or just kind of these amorphous terms that you can understand usually what someone means, but at the same time, you often, if you want to be specific, you do have to pin down what the specific person means, because it's kind of taken on a life of its own, but the consequences aren't like that big where you're like, I demand like a succinct meaning in this moment.
Yeah. So grifter and weaponize are both terms that I have made some hay out of getting angry about. I think to me, the thing about grifter and weaponize that irks me, this I think is a very common feature, and our side does it too. Everybody does this in online politics, and basically any politics that is expressed through language, which all politics is. Grifter and weaponize are like, it's always the other side that's doing them, right? Like, so there's the sense in which the terms are ill-defined is just that you never apply them to your friends, right? You only ever apply them to your enemies. Nobody would ever. The thing that I always say on Twitter is like, I'm a grifter for like making $50 writing some freelance article, but then when the person who disagrees with me and I get into a fight with on Twitter makes like $600,000 within the MacArthur Genius Grant, somehow that doesn't make them a grifter, right? It makes them a genius. So I make $50, I'm a grifter. They make $600,000. They're a genius,
people are always fuzzy with the Patreon, Substack type stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So it's who gets to be a grifter, who gets to be a genius, is determined by who you think, which positions you think could be honestly expressed by a smart person, right?
Right.
In a way, I take it as a compliment, because in some cases, I think the grifter accusation is something like, I know you're a smart person. No smart person could possibly believe the things that you're saying. So you must be only pretending to believe them in order to make money.
Right.
So maybe I shouldn't tell people that I don't make that much money, because then maybe they'll just think that I'm stupid. So yeah, I think, there's a lot of diversity in words, and there's a lot of different ways to attack different word usages.
Well, it's tough when you're like, you have to rely so much in this internet culture war space on intent, and it's really difficult to measure that through predominantly text-based medium, like Twitter, or even in writing. I mean, that's hard enough. You can obviously expand more, but Twitter is just so difficult to really get a grip on what someone believes. I mean, I'll often, sometimes I follow like YouTuber or Twitch streamer political drama and stuff like that. It's just like funny. It's almost like a Joe Rogan podcast to me. It's just like background noise that I don't really pay too much attention to, but enough to be like, a lot of times they'll break down like a take that they had on Twitter or whatever, and the take is intentionally inflammatory, or kind of like succinct in a way that it's meant to rile people up, or at least rile their own fan base up. And then later on, once it's determined that take was either incorrect or misleading or what have you, then they take it back and be like, oh, I didn't have all the information, or I didn't like understand. And then you're kind of like, well, wait, like, did you do this just for the attention or whatever, or really, like, were you consciously
was it a genuine mistake?
Because it's all measuring intent, and depend, like you're saying, depending on if you like that person or you dislike them, so much
give the generous interpretation. I think this is a constant, and of course I don't know if you've had this, but I have this actually more outside of, I have this more in my kind of close relationships in my life, which of course are often text, a lot of texting, a lot of deep chatting with my family members, and women in my life and things like that. I have an ex who would always whenever she wanted to have a long phone call in the evening, she would text me, "Can we talk tonight?" Which I always took as like, it's just like, you just feel a dread, right? Like the "can we talk," it means like, you know, there's something important. Probably she's gonna break up with me, right? And over text, you know, if you can't see somebody's facial expression, if you can't see their body language, things like that, it's very hard to, you know, even somebody, I'm not very good at like assessing, you know, I'm not a very socially adept person. I'm not good at assessing people's mood from their body language or anything like that. But even for me, not having that makes things a lot harder. And I think it probably is true on political Twitter as well. I have no idea how I come across really on, sometimes I read my tweets and I'm like, well, it's like really serious the way that I wrote it, you know? But like most, you can tell from talking to me, I don't really take the things I say that seriously. I just kind of say, you know, here's my take, you know, I'm trying my best, you know, this seems like the good argument to me in the moment. If it's wrong, I'll just like say that it's wrong, whatever. But it's hard to really like, you know, how do you express that and still kind of maintain your position as a commentator? One thing, you know,
without coming across like you're
exactly,
or like you're unsure of yourself or
exactly, yeah. So it's very hard to figure out how to put things in text in a way that reflects the actual like mood that you have about them and the actual level of commitment that you have about them. I often wish, you know, there are a lot of people on Twitter who, well, let's say this, there's a certain amount of people on Twitter who really don't like me, and there's a subset of those people, but certainly not the entire set of those people. There is a subset of those people who I wish, in fact, did like me and did not dislike me. And I often do wonder, like, wouldn't it be nice to like actually meet them, show them that I kind of like a teddy bear, you know, deep down. But then there's also this thing of like, you know, what, when I see it with other people, I think Freddie DeBoer has written about this. You know, he writes about being attacked by media people online and then meeting them in person, and they're just like super friendly.
Hey, what's up?
Yeah, hey, like how you doing, Freddie? I know you from the Twitter. And then they go back on Twitter and they're attacking him again, right?
Seen 1,000 times. Yep.
Yeah, and it's like at that point you have to ask, like, who is the? And this is, you know, for somebody who grew up with the internet, which I did, and it sounds like you did to an extent as well. You always have this worry, like, which is the, you know, it's very Baudrillardian, it's very much the Matrix, right? Like, which is the real me?
Yep.
Am I in person, like doing an act and then I become my real self on Twitter, or am I doing an act on Twitter and then my real self in person? And you have to wonder about it, about these people who are really vicious online. And then you hear, we have it so much in philosophy. They say, oh, just go to a conference with them. They'll be so nice. They're so sweet. And then on the internet, it's just like, this person should not be allowed to speak. This person should not be allowed to speak. This person is an idiot. This person is cruel. You know, this person is racist, blah, blah, blah.
In a lot of ways, that's the real grift, because I mean, and you see it in journalism a lot too, I think, where, you know, journalists, you know, there's a lot of these small, like niche communities. And then there's the kind of macro communities that, like, you know, in DC or New York or whatever, where a lot of these like writers, you know, the kind of mesh between pop culture, tabloid style writers, and like, you know, the more prestigious journalist style writers, or for like the New York Times or whatever. A lot of these people, you know, they form cliques and like, they know each other, and they also like, not even just like with other journalists, but other people, whether it's in PR or like, or various businesses that they work with or can get sources from, or platforms, even people that work for Twitter or et cetera. It's a difficult thing to see, because like you're saying, like a lot of these people, like they're super nice. Like you see them, whether it's at conferences, interviews, et cetera, and very amicable. But then, like you're saying, they'll jump right on Twitter, and it's like they start firing shots off. And I think in large part, I think for some of them, like I know several journalists in this space, and I really do think that they have good intentions for what it's worth. And I think the sort of steel man, whatever you want to say of it, is that these are people who, they understand the space, like you mentioned, like they grew up in internet culture. They understand that it's almost like a game, you know, when you're on these platforms, and that when you're in real life, it's like, okay, the game kind of like dissipates a bit. We have to be human again. But once we're back on the game, you know, it's kind of all things go. And
Yeah, just like World of Warcraft. Yeah.
yeah, it's like kind of LARPy almost. Like
Yeah.
I understand it at a certain level in certain situations, but then there's other levels, like I think you're alluding to, at like a relational level where you feel like I'm trying to develop a friendship, or like, you know,
Yeah.
something that I can stretch beyond, you know, we DM on Twitter sometimes, and I can trust you with information or what have you. And that's really tough to do. And
Yeah.
that's, like one of the questions I really wanted to ask you, and this is maybe like a broad topic, but being someone, you know, I think I reached out to you again, maybe I forget when it was, like a year ago or something like that. You were among a sort of like loose sphere of people, from across the political spectrum, like leftist, social justice oriented people, liberals, some even center right, libertarian minded people who I looked at relationally, and I was like, you know, like I can, it's all intuition at the end of the day, but like intuitively,
Right.
I'm gauging that this is a person who's acting in good faith. They seem like a real human. They're not like trying to just game the system with hot takes and whatnot. It's a person like worth engaging with. And I've noticed since then, obviously, like you've mentioned this earlier, that you often will deactivate your account, and like you often, I noticed, do try really hard, if you encounter a critique, you'll try to couch a response with like using more exclamation points and language in a way that kind of presents yourself like listen, I'm not mad, or I'm not like taking this super seriously. And I think that those are all signs to me of someone who does care and like is invested in their work in an honest way. So I guess like knowing how you've navigated these different ideological groups over the years, and how, like you mentioned, like there's people you wish you were friends with that don't like you, and then there's like all these different, how we refer to as tribal identities or whatever, that you have to kind of navigate. Like how do you work through that space on a relational level with these people as you kind of build into friendships and colleagues, and discovering who are my enemies? Like how do you think about that or work through that on a daily basis?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of why I deactivated a lot is because I do find it kind of overwhelming. I mean, I think part of it, thank you for all the things you said. It was very complimentary. I think I would probably say it in a different way that's a little less complimentary to myself.
Of
It's
course you
kind of
would.
more just about like what capacities I have, and like what capacities I lack. So I don't know if you were like this, but I was one of those kids who, like, maybe it took me a little longer than other people to realize that, like, when somebody asks, "How are you?" they don't actually, right? Like, they don't actually
Yeah, they're
care.
just
Like,
saying
there's this
hi.
like small talk thing.
Yep.
So I have this like slightly socially awkward thing of just like not understanding that a lot of relationality is kind of just performative, is not like sincere and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
um and it goes for some of the negative stuff on Twitter and some of the positive stuff online, but it also goes offline, but it also goes for some of the positive stuff on Twitter, right? Like you know when when some journalist switches from one job to another, you see just like hundreds of blue checks just being like, congratulations, congratulations.
Right.
Like, you don't know, I'm sure that these people don't know each other, right? Like you don't have this many people.
But they're
So
all
all,
loosely associated
yeah,
within like a
it's these very
similar
loose
space.
associations,
Yeah.
and probably some of it is kind of like advantage seeking by trying to form the connection in this kind of like
Yep.
vulnerable moment or something. um and I'm just very bad about thinking about relationships strategically in that way. I just kind of like will talk to whoever, and basically can't do much other than like saying how I actually feel about things. um
And that will run like in terms of a platform like Twitter, where so much of the culture is built on optics and
yeah,
rhetoric,
yeah,
and just like, and like we were mentioning earlier, just I mean, I hate to say it, because like when you say aesthetics, it implies like a lot of disingenuine, you know, nature to people individually, and like I don't know. Like, I don't know if I would call it disingenuine per se, but like, there's definitely something to be said. I mean, culturally, like, this is just what people do. I mean, when there's cultural trends, people hop on those trends, and it's not to say they don't actually believe those things, but like they exhibit attitudes that are just kind of
yeah.
like what their friends are exhibiting, and what their colleagues are exhibiting, and it just becomes like a second nature thing. Whereas, like, I understand what you're saying. You're not consciously thinking about how to engage with those topics. Like when you see one of these topics come through, you're just like, like you kind of like do a second take and then you think it through. Whereas like most people, when they see a take that they know their sort of group identity
Right.
or their like family or personal experience, whatever, tells them this is good or bad. It's a very easy switch for them. Whereas like what you're saying,
Right.
it's like more difficult to understand how other people do that because you don't see it that way.
Yeah, I think in general the belief is genuine. I don't really know another way to parse it. In general, in these group situations, the belief is genuine. In a way, like often the virtue signaling accusation, it's a lot like the grifter accusation,
I hate
right?
it.
Where
Yeah.
it's just like, and at the same time, I do believe that grifting and virtue signaling are both like things that happen. It's just like there's no real route to having good evidence for it in an individual case, and the accusation is never productive.
It's like the difference between, I was just talking to a friend about this the other day. It's a difference between, saying I support LGBTQ people in the context of something specific, like something happens in the news, you're commenting on that thing, or like something happens to your friend, you're defending your
Right.
friend, etc. Versus like there's not really an occasion, or maybe there's not a specific occasion and you're just throwing it out there like I need attention right now, or there's a broader cultural movement, a zeitgeist, and you want to hop into the zeitgeist and get clout from that. And then even then, you don't know if the person's intentions are disingenuous. All you know is that like it feels to me like there's a probability that there might be more of like you just kind of hopped on this thing. But like you're saying, levying that accusation almost feels fruitless because you just have no idea.
And it's also like, it's not like if you see somebody say, I support LGBTQ people, you think, oh, you probably don't actually support them.
Exactly.
It's more like, well, you're using that, you're saying that in this moment to gain some kind of advantage, but that kind of advantage, like saying something in the right moment because you believe it, that is like not hard. Like everybody picks the right moments to say the thing, right? Like if you think a woman is beautiful, you like wait for the right moment to tell her, right? Or like if I have a take about something, I try to put it in the right magazine or something like that. So that just the fact that people are saying it at a time when it's advantageous to them is not to me, that's not enough to
because we all do it
signaling, because it's you can't just say everything you think all at the same time. So that I don't think is that I think I can definitely parse. But you were talking about the difficulty of these relationships at the individual level. It's something that I feel a lot. I kind of, this is like a big, I don't want to say contradiction exactly, but a kind of tension in my personality that I do really want most people to like me, most people that I interact with. And then I have that contrarian side where I'm like, once a certain number of people like me, I feel a bit hemmed in by.
You're not interested anymore.
Yeah, I'm not interested. Yeah, and I feel like the task of, I'm just kind of like all of those people who already like me added together, and the task of kind of like not turning anybody away.
You can't offend anybody.
Yeah, exactly. It becomes a very difficult task. So just like at the moment, right, like I have strong links with the original IDW people. I have strong links with this sort of like anti-liberal Catholic faction. I have strong links with some of the anti-woke leftists. I have strong links with some of the anti-woke philosophers and with some of the anti-woke philosophers. I have links with the Heterodox Academy people, and I have links with the much more edgy people who are like Heterodox Academy is just like the controlled opposition or whatever. And it does, like, to be completely honest, it really does like add together to at certain points where it's just like something happens and I'm just like, not even at the level of like, I can't say what I feel because I'm worried about offending somebody, but it becomes very hard to figure out how you feel. Right. Because you kind of have all these voices in your head of all the people you're modeling, all the people who you consider close to you, and you're trying to, and I often, when I write things, I often think like, here's my specific audience, right? This person is who I'm writing this for. So for example, I reviewed the Cornell philosopher Kate Mann's book entitled back in September or October.
Right, mansplaining.
Yeah, mansplaining. So I thought I wrote basically a negative review of the book with a friend who there was a thing because he didn't want to hurt his career in philosophy, so he stayed anonymous. It was his idea to write the review, and so it was funny because a lot of people were like, oh, it shouldn't be allowed to like be anonymous or something. And I was like, why should it be allowed? It's kind of weird. But so that review, I specifically wrote with another grad student in mind, who I knew is a very woke grad student, but is also more of like a Bernie socialist type to a degree, and is very anti Kate Mann because she was like very much on the anti Bernie bro stuff, and was like the Bernie bros are being mean to Liz Warren and mean to Hillary Clinton and stuff like
that whole
that.
subdivision.
So I basically everything I wrote in there, I was thinking of this one particular woman. I was like, I want to be able to get her on my side with this review, because I know that deep down she agrees with me. Unfortunately, she hated the review, so it was very sad. But I often the things I write, I'm often like, here are the people who probably don't agree with me yet, the specific people who I know personally, who I would like to come to my side with this. And I don't know, when there's such a wide range of people, it is, to me, it's very difficult managing all of it. I think there are people who are more socially adept who do it with great fluidity. But for me, I need to take time away, because it's just a lot of relationships to manage at once.
Well, I think some people naturally, for whatever the reason may be, are just given more grace than other people. Like, perfect example I think of is Cornel West. It's like there's tons of people who disagree with Cornel West from both the left and the right on various subjects, depending on the interview he's given. But he's given a lot of grace because of his temperament. I mean, he's very friendly. He calls everybody, brothers and sisters. He's always laughing. He keeps like a sort of levity to his style of discourse. And in a lot of ways, even though he has in a lot of ways radical positions, like he couches them in like really unifying, like moderate language. And I think that's such a rare, difficult trait. And that's why I think he's so loved and admired, because for people like you or I, and I also consider myself someone who I'm not as much of a writer as you. I don't spend as much time in this space. I'm more of an observer for what it's worth.
But I know you well enough to know that you have a real variety of relationships.
Right. Exactly. And that's what I was going to get at, is that like, I feel the same tension you do, where like I have a variety in these relationships. And I think to some extent, like what you're describing, it's almost like a healthy projection, because it does challenge you internally to be like, what is the reaction going to be to this thing? How can I plan for that? Rhetorically, optically, what's the most optimal way to approach this subject? I think that can be really healthy, but to your point, I mean, it's also incredibly debilitating when you aren't like solidified in your own ideology, which people like you and I maybe aren't. Like, maybe I would say maybe we can get into this if you'd like. I'd say maybe I am a little more than you. Like, I'm pretty comfortable self-identifying as things like progressive or social democrat, etc. But I still handle my public image, whatever you want to call it, and even like my personal relationships at an optics level, where I've been engaging in the discourse for 7-8 years at this point, and like I've learned over that time. I've been a firebrand, I've been the contrarian, I've been the moderate, I've played these characters, and you find over time, what is the most optimal approach for someone like me. And for me, like I do try to moderate a lot of my language, even if I am expressing a specific ideological viewpoint, because I've found that in doing that, I do get a lot of people on my opposition who are comfortable reaching out to me, especially privately, to talk about it. And without that, I lose that. And I'm not really, like we were saying earlier, I'm not someone interested in building a following that I can kind of like put out a tweet, then it instantly gets 100 likes and we all agree and it's all great. I'm more interested in figuring out, like, how do I say things that aren't quite being said this way? What's a new thought, even if it's a little provoking. But it's really difficult to navigate that when you don't have like a specific grounding in any ideology or group, and you're trying to like spin between several of them, like it sounds like you are.
Yeah, I think it does make it difficult. And the interesting thing to me is like the sign that it's still difficult is a sign that the whole like groupthink, virtue signaling type analysis is like, it's not quite complete, right? Because you still feel, even if you're not a member of like a well-defined group, you still feel social pressures because humans are social animals,
Yep.
right? And maybe I experience the social pressures more as like projections of individual people that I know rather than some like, general group consensus of a group that I'm a part of.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's basically the same thing. I think I don't, some somebody in philosophy Twitter, another grad student, a couple months ago, there was this thing where somebody disagreed with me about something and then somebody else screenshotted it and a bunch of people, were insulting me over it. And one of these people said something like Oliver presents himself as like so objective and like free from bias and like free from social blah blah or whatever. I was so confused by it because I really don't think of myself that way at all. I
Right.
don't have any self-perception. I know that there are people in the IDW who have like said that they are, right.
They
There are
think they're
people who
above
have,
the discourse.
yeah, they've said
Right.
like, now that I left the left, I can think for myself or whatever.
Right.
But like, I don't really have I try to think for myself to the extent that I'm able. And I try to be free of social pressures because I have a kind of like, German romanticism ideal of like the authentic, I'm like the authentic artist of my belief, like I'm, like Goethe
Yeah.
or somebody like that, I have to be free and like express my soul or whatever. But it's not like when push comes to shove, I think of myself as being independent from all the social influences in my life or from the various like incentives. There are some incentives to be conformist and there are some incentives to be contrarian, right? I more think of myself as somebody who like has tried to balance those in a conscious way, and who like is responsive to being told that he's wrong and things like that, and like takes other people's critiques seriously, rather than like, I don't think of myself as somebody who like spontaneously generates like auto critiques of my own positions that are, and if I
Right.
didn't come up with with it myself, then I must be right, or anything like that. So I think we're all in this position, and I think it's scarier on social media than it is anywhere else, right? And you're more aware of it on social media. I think to myself, I can probably name most of my followers who have the most followers themselves, right, on Twitter. Like, it's just something that is in my mind, right? And they're all very different people.
Yeah.
So there's always a danger. And I could never, in high school, I was friends with like a bunch of people in a bunch of the different cliques, right? I thought of myself as being kind of above cliques. There's one time where I tried to have a birthday party. So that's my brother's dog. I tried to have, she's very small. I tried to have a birthday party where I was just like, I'll just combine like my favorite people from all the different cliques. It's like, it didn't go very well.
Oh yeah, they're
like
disasters.
it's a disaster, right? And so I would love to be like, here are the people on Twitter who I think are smart. Let me just put all of them in a room together. But I don't think it would never, I think it's very dangerous.
I kind of tried that with our one little group chat.
Yeah.
And
I think
it was there was some cohesion, but like literally within the first day or a couple days, there was a pattern development where like certain cliques started to kind of dominate the conversation.
Yeah.
And then obviously if you're part of another clique or you're outside all these cliques or whatever,
Yeah.
when you're looking through this, you're thinking, oh shit, like I'm on the outside of this. I don't want to stir the pot, which is, I'm of the type of person who wants to stir that pot, but it's
Right.
difficult when you're when you don't really know the people all that well. Like the relational aspect of it really makes it difficult to navigate, I think, because you don't know. You could say something in that group chat and then suddenly, like you mentioned, you might be getting screenshotted and then sent in another group chat, and there's no like rapport until those relationships really develop, and it's tough to do that on Twitter.
Yeah, that's another thing. So when I joined, okay, so the first time I was on Twitter was as a completely different kind of account where I was just like friendly with people who I played video games with. I have a hobby where I try to play video games very quickly. I'm not very good at it. But yeah. So I did speedruns at a time. And I was on Twitter under that account during the Hulk Hogan Gawker lawsuit.
Oh yeah.
And I was so obsessed with this lawsuit when it happened. This was like one of the, it feels like a long time ago now, but it was 5 years ago. And I think it was a big and kind of under discussed now as for what it actually was. Like a lot of people are like, oh, the death of Gawker, but it was like a big battle in the culture wars, seen as like between, well, to an extent, seen as between like a group of journalists who are like, in part try to victimize like random people and get clicks from it. This is my very anti-Gawker way of putting it. The pro-Gawker way of putting it would be, it was there was a tech billionaire, it was tech versus Gawker and the money won, right? Tech versus journalism and the money started to win. And the kind of tech versus journalism narrative, you see it in Taylor Lorenz's reporting on TikTok, you see it in reporting on Reddit, and especially reporting on Substack. Anyway, that's a completely different issue. I joined under my real name in late 2016, right before the election, and like followed a bunch of journalists and would like respond to them and they wouldn't respond back and things like that.
Yeah.
So I was basically like a reply guy for a few months. And then I started dating this girl who like looked to see on her own if I had a Twitter account, and just saw me like arguing with random people. And she said something to me like, aren't you worried that like you're like not gonna be able to get a job because of this account? This is before I went back to grad school. So for about a year and a half, starting then, this was in like spring or like late winter of 2017, I changed to an anonymous account. And let me tell you, being an anonymous account is very, very different from having a name associated with your account. Even though I was never completely anonymous, there would be things that would be published under my real name that I would link to as my own pieces. But, you can quote tweet whoever you want, they're not, what are they going to do? Quote tweet your anonymous account? You'll just quote tweet them back and you'll be in a fight with a big person, right? And all you can do is gain from it, right?
Yeah, consequence free.
Yeah. I think, what is it, George Bernard Shaw, who said, don't wrestle with a pig, you both get muddy and the pig enjoys it, or something like that. So I was the pig, right? When I was anonymous, I was the pig who enjoyed wrestling in the mud with like real people. And that was a lot of fun. In a lot of ways, I think it was more fun than having a name on Twitter. And a lot of my favorite accounts now are anonymous, not just political ones, but they're like, even just like, if I had a bad date, what could I tweet about it, right? Anything I could tweet about a bad date, expressing that it was bad, I could just get quote tweeted and called a misogynist or something, right? So I can never, like, very few personal things,
right,
that I can tweet, right? So yeah, that dynamic is definitely there. And yeah, worries about screenshots, worries about, I'm actually much less careful than I should, I think, about what I say in private. I'm on Discord servers where we joke around a lot. I'm in a bunch of DM groups where there are like some very, usually I'm pretty quiet in them, but I'm in DM groups that have some people who are much more problematic than I am.
Right. Yeah, I've been, even just through the brand account that I manage, the Stakem stuff, man, dude, over the years, I have been in every type of group chat you can imagine, because people just add random brands.
They just add you,
yeah, and they just, like, I think most times they assume the brand won't respond or isn't looking or whatever, but I almost always,
you're looking,
yeah, like, and of course I don't spend hours doing it. I'll just kind of drop in, see what's going on. And these are everything. I've been in communist group chats, I've been in far right group chats, I've been in K-pop group chats.
Well, the K-pop are the most dangerous ones, is my understanding. They're the most dangerous people on Twitter.
And they are so fast. Like, it's mostly kids, obviously, but it's insane how much they understand the Twitter culture and how, like, they need to get things out and get them moving really quick. But it does help give you perspective, I guess, to see like how especially anonymous accounts operate in group chats. Like the sort of freedom to, it's like a little, like a sort of a distillation of the old 4chan and all that in some ways. But.
Yeah, I think, but I mean, Twitter also has something that, what you're saying about the speed of it, Twitter also has this thing that 4chan didn't. Well, I don't know. I was never on 4chan. I've read it a few times, and I think I was too old when I started trying to read it to understand it. I was more into like the message board culture. But the message boards, they didn't have this thing of like, what Twitter and Facebook, just the likes and the retweets and the shares. Maybe Tumblr had this. Maybe people who were on Tumblr understand Twitter a little bit better,
They
because
do. Yeah, for
things would
sure.
get reblogged and
Mhm.
things could blow up so quickly there. I think part of the reason that I've never really had a tweet go viral. Actually, my most popular tweet was like it was this like anti-Trump tweet. He said something about making a perfect phone call, and I like put it into the lyrics of "Call Me Maybe" or something like that. And I wrote it basically like, I was just like, this is so stupid and corny. And I was just like, my followers are going to just be like, Oliver, you're being stupid and corny again. And a few of them retweeted it, and then it got picked up by like a bunch of resistance accounts, and it ended up with like 10,000 likes, just like from people who actually thought it was really funny, even though I'd
It's always
intended
the
it in a
dumbest
corny
stuff
way.
that goes
It's
viral.
always the dumbest stuff that goes viral. And I think like, so the fact that I don't go viral, and I think it's because my experience of the internet really is as of a bunch of like, it's very pre-social media in a way. It's as a bunch of these very tight-knit communities, more like the group chats, things like that. And what I'm used to is more like you act slightly differently with every group, right? In my group chat that's like all very intense Catholics, which I'm not going to talk about certain things that I might talk about in the group chat that is literally called fellas, right? In the
Mhm.
group chat with the fellas, you might talk about certain things you do that you wouldn't talk about with Catholic mothers, right?
Yeah, right.
Um, and so that's, I think my experience of the old internet, the Discord servers, the group chats, and things like that fit with it a lot better than this genuinely public and global phenomenon of social media.
Well, that's what it is,
Um,
because the new internet's like it's a combination of the old internet with this new like macro level internet where I refer to them as rooms. I'll be like,
yeah,
we're all on Twitter, we're all in these different rooms. You might be in weird Twitter's room or philosophy Twitter's room or sports Twitter's room or whatever it might
right.
be. But these rooms all have their doors open. And anytime, you tweet something that starts to get retweeted and amplified into these other rooms, eventually it always has the potential to reach the room, the
Yeah,
macro
exactly.
level
Yeah, yeah,
where
yeah.
everybody is. And then suddenly, especially with someone's writing like yours, you almost, I'm not saying you don't want to, because it would be still, you'd still get clout and readership and all that. But like, once you get into that macro level room, you're no longer speaking to your audience. You're speaking to people who
Yeah,
know nothing about you, and context matters not at all.
yeah,
And
and then
now,
you get the context collapse, I think they call it,
yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. And then that's a difficult. We all. I mean, I've had tweets go viral, like big tweets go viral, but they've only ever been in relation to memes, essentially. So
Right.
they weren't anything with consequence. And I think like if you're talking about like political cultural commentary, that's like
Yeah,
it's a time bomb, I would say, for almost everybody except for left Twitter. I think
mm.
left/weird Twitter is this weird, they wouldn't want to admit it, but I think they own such a large amount of capital
Yeah.
on Twitter because they've been on it. Like weird Twitter is one of the original
It's one of
subcultures.
the original Twitters, and they're very good at it. And
They're
they
so good
started
at
it
it.
as something awful, and they learned Twitter, and there's so many, drill and the accounts that are kind of like mini drills.
Hmm. And even the
Um,
public personas, like even a lot of the reporters, like Ken Klippenstein or Klippenstein,
yeah,
like
yeah,
a
yeah,
lot of these
yeah,
figures who are in that space, like they can tweet pretty super
yeah.
inflammatory stuff. It can explode to the point where it's trending on Twitter, and they don't really
It
deal with
doesn't
that
really,
much
yeah, it
consequence.
doesn't really matter that much. I think even like yeah, like the Brunigs, I think maybe in a certain sense came from weird Twitter. Like Ryan Cooper, I think
Hmm.
is linked to weird Twitter. Yeah, and I think yeah, at a certain point, it's partly just about like what your posse to a certain extent, right? It's about kind of who you have behind you, and
Who you roll up with, like how many people
exactly,
are
yeah, yeah,
backing you
yeah,
up. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It's well, this is stupid, but I was just gonna say this is like why in one of Plato's dialogues, Socrates suggests that like we shouldn't ever write anything down. We should just talk to each other. And I think it's basically for this reason that once you start writing things down, they're going to be misinterpreted.
Right.
And
It's
I
like
think
a form. We're getting further and further from the true form of
yeah, exactly.
what we're
And from
saying.
yeah,
Yeah.
and from from what you truly believe. And but I'm sure we've also both done it ourselves. You read something and you say, oh, I'm sure this means this thing, and somebody else explains, well, in the context of like there's been like a dozen articles about this and blah blah blah.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And I think it's hard to be on both sides of it, right? You're talking across a gap. And although the assumptions that people make sometimes are really funny. I've never had quite the thing where somebody's like, did you read the article? And then I'm like, I wrote the article. But there was one thing where one of my tweets got attacked by a few people. And somebody found in 2018, I wrote a review of Jordan Peterson's book along with the Chapter Trap House book.
Oh yeah, that was a great article.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's probably one of my, that's one of my best.
It was genius pairing them together. It's like,
yeah, I was so happy when the pairing came up. It was just like I think it was genuinely unexpected, and I think it genuinely did fit together. So I was incredibly happy with it. So somebody, I had this as a pinned tweet for a while, and somebody got mad at me in some other thread, and obviously went to my profile and looked for other things to get angry about, as people do. And they responded to this pinned tweet, and they were like, "Oh, I just knew that somebody like you would be a Jordan Peterson fan." And I responded to them. I was like, "It's a negative review. You didn't read the review. It's just, you can just click the thing that you're responding to."
That's great.
And then they were like, "Okay, maybe it was a negative review, but like, given the other things you said, you have to admit that I was like right in assuming that you should be, or something." And I was like, "What are you talking about? What do you mean? What are you talking about?" And so I think that one problem that I run into, again, this goes back to my conceit of myself as being like, uncategorizable and like a real, really sui generis and things like that. To perceive this big room that you're talking about, right? To perceive the vast kind of like diversity of people, we need.
I guess we should call it the house to be appropriate.
The house. Let's call it the house.
Yeah,
that's beautiful.
analogy, yeah.
To be in the house, right? You have to figure out what room people are coming from. Let's say, right? You have to be able to categorize people. You have to be able to say, oh, you're this kind of person, you're that kind of person, right? Just to be able to interact with this many people, to be able to perceive the fact that there are this many people out there, right? So there's a certain extent to which like it's hard to blame somebody if they're like, okay, I'm just going to categorize you as like, you said this thing about like evolutionary psychology, and I categorize that as like Jordan Peterson-esque, so I'm just putting you in the Jordan Peterson box. That is to an extent the way that people's brains work, and I've definitely done that to other people. If people are using kind of social justice-y buzzwords, I'm going to say you're in my social justice box now, right? It doesn't mean that I don't block them or anything. The only person I've ever blocked on Twitter was somebody who used to be a friend of mine, and then started like quote tweeting everything I said with an insult, and then DM'd me and was like, please block me. I kind of like can't stop insulting you. And I was like, okay. Then I saw recently he still is insulting me from behind the block, but so obviously I didn't help him in any way. I feel really bad about it because I must have done something wrong. But he also
sounds more like their problem for what it's worth.
Yeah, I mean, at this point it is, but maybe I caused their problem. But anyway, I don't block people. I only mute people. And I'm also really bad about, usually when I see that little button where it's like view muted tweet, I just click it.
Oh yeah, me too. Of course.
It's just terrible. So I just don't take care of I don't curate my experience in the right way at all. I follow way too many people. I follow way too many girls, especially on Twitter. So yeah, I have all these problems with not using the site in the right way, and that probably contributes to like all the reasons that I'm constantly deactivating, and the fact that I spend too much time on it.
Right. Well, I kind of want to like, let me just tie this into something else I wanted to ask you, because kind of going through this difficulty of navigating the different rooms and all of that. I mean, you mentioned, I think you alluded to it earlier in our talk, that you've been someone over the years who's, you kind of came into the space critiquing the sort of social justice left, but then over time, you started to kind of build a critique then of the IDW and a lot of the anti-woke stuff. So you have to the point of that person who tried to troll you over thinking that you're a Jordan Peterson fan, you have enough cred or whatever you want to call it, to kind of be like, hey, look, I at least have a self-criticism, even if I do agree or am associated with this group or that person. So like, how do you, and I know, and this is a weird question, and I know you've again, you probably have similar notions to me in this way. It's difficult to talk about, but I just want to poke you on it and see if you have. I'm sure you've thought about it before.
Yeah.
How do you self-identify ideologically, or like, 'cause I know my assumption just projecting onto you is that, I think I've maybe even said this to you before. I kind of feel like you're what I would consider like a new conservative, or like a good faith conservative. How I look at like the sort of how the way in which at least cultural conservatives in recent years have really like drifted into populism, both policy wise and rhetoric wise. It's very much like it's strongly on the otherizing of X group, otherizing immigrants, otherizing LGBTQ people, and so on. And you obviously don't exhibit that same behavior, that same rhetoric, but at the same time you do kind of broadly act as like a more cultural, like, I'm pumping the brakes on
Yeah.
this type of stuff. And of course, language is tricky. Maybe you view yourself more as like a liberal in the classical sense, not in the Dave Rubin sense, of course, but the real sense. But I don't know, how do you think about that? Like, do you have a label? Do you like to talk about that? Or
it's such a difficult question. I mean, politically, again, this is a kind of tribal thing, but I've just always been a Democrat. I don't, when I watch a Republican primary, I'm interested in like an objective horse racy kind of way, but I don't really have preferences among Republican candidates. I don't know why that is. A few people have tried to be like, Oliver, given the things you write, you should like consider becoming a Republican. I don't think too much about politics. One reason is that like, I really think that to have like really strong opinions on politics, you should understand economics and economic issues. And I don't really. I have a lot of friends who are libertarians, and I have a lot of friends who are Marxists. And I don't. I don't.
Like, if you were boxed in a room with that libertarian or Marxist friend, you don't feel confident enough economically to be like, I can substantiate where I
exactly. I wouldn't try to take them down, right? Because I just don't know enough. And in part, that is one thing about me that is a little bit. So one thing I am tactical about is sometimes I look at certain debates and I'm like, it's really okay that I don't have a stake in that debate. And I don't need to know anything more about it. I don't want to be part of it. I don't want to feel that I have a view that I have to express. I just don't want to have a position on it. Most economic debates are about this. Israel is a debate like this for me. And that has been really good for me because I already argue about way too much. But it also makes it hard to really feel that I have like a robust political identification. To a certain extent, there's like one group of people who kind of assume that I agree with them about everything that I don't talk about. And then there's another group of people who kind of assume that I disagree with them about everything that I don't talk about. With regards to conservatism, I do find a lot of my young conservative friends, who obviously I've made through doing this online writing and stuff like that, there's a shift within the Republican Party and the broader conservative movement, obviously, that you're aware of, away from kind of the Reagan era and libertarian consensus, away from the fusionism of, fusionism was a word, my understanding is, fusionism was a word for the combination of libertarian economic thought and social conservatism.
Right.
And part of what you have now is some of the libertarians are becoming more Democrats, and a lot of the social conservatives are becoming less libertarian.
There's this like kind of new, it's a meme, but there's that new like neoliberal movement where there's like there's like the progressive soc dem wing of that, but then there's the center right wing of that. That's taking form.
And the thing is, you know, again, I like plenty of I'm mutuals with the R neoliberal account on Twitter, you know. I like plenty of the neoliberals. Sometimes they say things that really make me think that I experience the world in a different way than they do. So, for example, I once had a conversation with a self-identified neoliberal who said something like, sex work should be legal because when you do something as a job, you get better at it. So the more sex workers there are, and the higher proportion of sex comes from sex work, the better sex everybody will be having. And I was just like, I just think that like my perception of sex is just like at such a distance from this person's perception of sex. And that sort of conversation makes me think maybe I should just convert to Catholicism.
They're
because
treating it like it's an economic, just
exactly,
like
it's very, and I'm not, you know, I'm not that way. But I'm also not, you know, I meet people on Tinder, right? Like I'm not a Catholic, I'm a degenerate by like most Catholic standards. In a way, I just think of myself as like what a kind of left-leaning Democrat would have been like 20 years ago. I basically, a lot of my political views kind of calcified when I was a teenager during the Iraq War and things like that. And in a kind of anti-curious way, you know, in a way that isn't the way I am about things that I really care about, like philosophy and art and things like that. But to a certain extent, I really haven't updated a lot of them. And I'm kind of happy because I think that a lot of the updating that like people I know have done over the past decade has been in line with this great awakening stuff, which of course I'm very, very skeptical of. But in terms of like affectively, I'm interested in the possibility that these kind of like socially conservative Marxists will find a way to like join up with like the Marco Rubios of the world and form this like crazy new coalition that is completely different from what I've known my whole life. I'm not interested in it because I will vote for it. I'll just keep voting for like whichever Democrat seems the most trustworthy to me every election, right? But if like I am, like you said, I'm a contrarian. I'm anti-institutional. To a strong degree, I'm kind of populist in my epistemology. I think experts know less than we think, and normal people know more than we think. It's not to say that normal people are trustworthy. It's just that most people aren't trustworthy. And normal people, at least when there's kind of like skin in the game, when there's some consequence to their belief, normal people, I think, have relatively reliable belief forming mechanisms, and experts have less skin in the game than they ought to. And of course, I wrote something on the replication crisis. I reviewed Stuart Ritchie's book about the replication crisis. I think in fields that are adjacent to woke stuff, especially social psychology, there were just like years of bad results being pushed as science and being accepted by experts.
Right, like papers that were just like, what was it, like, I forget the original study, but isn't it like 40 or 50 or 60% of papers couldn't be replicated?
Yeah, and of course it's hard to I also, you know, in true trying to do this thing the right way fashion, if something doesn't replicate, it doesn't 100% mean that the original paper was wrong or that it was done in a bad way or anything like that. The failure to replicate has to be interpreted as well. So it doesn't mean that 50% of results were false, but it might.
And to your broader point, like kind of speaking to your populism in this way, I think it's important for maybe people to understand that there's, when we think about like the kind of COVID world that we're in, or post, not post, but, you know, kind of post the initial like drum of it all, we start to see the thing that gets the most mainstream attention from the from the masses, we'll say, just the average people, is the sort of conspiracy theory propensity that so many people have, just because it's the most click worthy, it's the most sensationalist, it's the most crazy thing that we're seeing from it all. But to your point, there's also a broader skepticism among the general public of these institutions that isn't often taken seriously by the people in those positions. And with that, they're unable to strengthen their own institutions and credibility. It's like not only the replication crisis, but even like thinking about like the motivations behind what perhaps why that even came to be, thinking about how there aren't incentives in academia to publish repeat papers or like or studies that try to suss out is this something that is valid or not. And there's more money in novelty, there's more money in new studies, there's more monies in papers that will already kind of affirm like an institution's biases or a cultural prejudice. And these are all things that I think they don't, like you're saying, they don't completely discredit these institutions or experts or anything like that, but they offer up a valid critique that warrants more investigation and warrants just more honesty with people, because without that, it only feeds this sort of populist energy where people feel like they're being lied to and that they're not being told everything by these experts, and they're being looked down the nose at, or like these people in their pulpit or whatever it might be. And that's a good critique to have, I think, when it's a level.
Yeah, and I think so I'm going to go back to what we were talking about before, but I just wanted to say what you're saying about like the skepticism, whether it's right or wrong, has to be taken seriously. I think this was one of the lessons of the 2016 election, right? One of the lessons of the Clinton campaign was like, there were reasons that Clinton was unpopular.
Right.
And one of the views that people within the Democratic Party had was sort of like, well, the people who dislike her are wrong to dislike her. They dislike her for the wrong reasons. A lot of them are just sexist, right?
Yeah.
And it turns out that even if that's true, like they still vote, right? Even if it's true that a lot of the people who are skeptical of science at the moment just don't understand what's going on with it, they're still part of the society, right? So I think it's just one of the broad lessons. And you saw this with the media, right? Like, how often did the media crow about Donald Trump's low approval ratings? And it's true. Trump was just as poorly liked as Clinton, right? They were both very unpopular candidates, and he was a very, very unpopular president. But then if you look at the media's approval ratings, right? The media that is being so happy about Trump having low approval ratings, the media's approval ratings were like 15 or 20%, right? Then you look at Congress, they're like 10%, right? So all these people who are like, everybody hates Trump so much, you have to look at the context. Nobody likes anything right now.
Yeah.
There's no person, no institution that's like trusted. We're at a moment of extremely low social trust in institutions and in individuals.
It's been trending that way for
decades.
Been
trending that way overall.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a very strange moment that I think has not been taken seriously enough. And it is not, I don't think, some people say the right way to take it seriously is to say, this low trust is the product of a propaganda machine, blah, blah, blah. And I don't think that's the way to take it seriously, right? Yeah. Like, if your girlfriend is mad at you, you don't say, well, your anger is like the product of a propaganda machine, so I can understand where it came from. So I understand you now, right? No, you have to understand it from her perspective, right? So you need to understand this low trust from the perspective of the people who become skeptical.
And I think along with that, this is something that I'm often critical of when I see it on Twitter. When I graduated high school in 2010, and that's the year that I kind of had my ideological awakening, whatever you want to call it, where I got really into the new atheist scene. I got into Noam Chomsky, bought a bunch of Chomsky books. I was just, I didn't know shit about shit. I was just kind of like, I was into YouTube debates, and I was just trying to like dip my toes in. And I understood then, and I'll even say this is maybe just like a gem for anybody who might even know the reference, but even back then there were these like compilation videos on YouTube of Joe Rogan podcasts, where Joe Rogan back then was way more purely anti-establishment in a less politicized or ideological way than he is today, where he's a lot more right-leaning, at least per his attitudes and the guests he has on. back then he was like purely, when he talked politics, it was all anti-military industrial complex. It was like, anti, establishment for like talk, like drug legalization or drugs being illegal, that type of thing. And they used to do these compilations that were just like really, getting into Operation like Northwoods and MK Ultra and stuff like that. Just been as like a kid, I was 18 years old. I was like, man, this is like, I never have heard of this stuff or seen this stuff. And it was
Right.
mind bending to me at the time. And I do think culturally, when we talk about this stuff at a broad level, that there is something to the argument of like manufactured consent, like Chomsky's thesis from decades ago at this point. I do think that exists. I mean, I work in advertising. I know the power of PR. I know the power of influence and manipulation to people in various forms of media. That said, I do think to your point that people often fall back on things like manufacturing consent as a sort of catch-all excuse for why people believe the things they believe, when oftentimes it's more like those beliefs are impacted by cultural trends, and then consent is manufactured through political ideologues or corporations or opportunists who can then tap in to that cultural unrest. Like, I don't think a Rush Limbaugh would have gotten off the ground in the late 80s, early 90s if there hadn't been a cultural movement in the underbelly to be there for it. So when we talk about it, it's kind of this like two-pronged thing. We're like, yeah, maybe it's a loop where like, the propaganda feeds into it, but propaganda only is effective insofar as there's like a cultural underbelly and also like economic disenfranchisement and factors like that to make it so, which is interesting.
Yeah, I completely agree. And there's a mix of, it's difficult for me because I do have this overriding view of like, we should be more skeptical of the rationality of experts and more trusting of the rationality of normal people. When you look at anybody, and it's almost like the way we were talking about our own beliefs right at the beginning of this conversation, right? If you look at anybody, the reasons that they say and believe the things that they do, it's a mix of rational and irrational factors, right? And it's a mix of even the irrational factors, some of them will be understandable and some of them will be not understandable, right? Like, so why might a poor white person might be driven to racism by believing certain things about crime, which could be rational kind of from their perspective, or by not being able to find work and thinking that all the jobs were taken by like illegal immigrants,
right?
Which could be irrational but kind of like understandable, like everybody you can kind of understand why, because everybody needs to find work, right? And then at the end of the day, there could also be an irrational impulse to just like, everybody wants to have somebody who's like lower on the totem pole than they are. We would say that that's like an irrational reason for the belief that is not understandable, right? Or at least not that is reprehensible, right? So some irrational impulses, we say, okay, like you're economically disenfranchised, I'm not going to blame you for it, right? So I'm not going to blame you for this belief. Other irrational influences, we would say, okay, I do blame you for being influenced in this way because it's not good to like want to dominate other people or something like that. So there's all these different ways in which we judge each other. This is what, for the class I'm teaching in the fall, I'm writing kind of like a book called Political Beliefs. And one of the sections that I've completed is on the different ways that we judge each other for beliefs. So sometimes we judge each other based on whether the beliefs conform to the evidence. Other times we judge each other based on what our beliefs say about our characters, right? It's not clear to what extent we should do the latter. It's a vexed issue in philosophy. But yeah, I think what you said is completely correct about it's bidirectional. Whatever relationship we take to be the propagandistic relationship, it's not like people just eat up whatever, right? If that were the case, then this kind of widespread skepticism would be inexplicable, right? If people just ate up whatever was told to them, why wouldn't people just believe the media, right?
Right.
So you have to explain, in the current day, people are getting a ton of messages from a ton of sources, right? You have to have an explanation of here's why they actually believe this one message over this other message. And I think, like I said, I think it's going to be a mix of rational and irrational factors. And just like we were talking about with the grifters and the virtue signaling and stuff like that, I think you have to start with the rational factors. I think it's dismissive not to, and it's usually unproductive not to. And it also can be kind of hopeless not to, right? Like if you just say people are fundamentally irrational and will believe anything, well, what are you supposed to do then? Like, what's the next step?
Right. Yeah. It's so disempowering. That's what I hate about people that use those excuses as a catch-all, because like you can completely use them as like a partial analysis, like a tool to be like, yeah, it's like here, this explains X percentage of this cause or this reason, but you can't use it as a catch-all to be like, this is why the things are the way they are. It just strips people of their individual agency, essentially.
Yeah. I completely agree. And it's something I struggle with a lot, and sometimes I don't succeed, because part of my corpus in writing anti-woke stuff, part of what we do is we write these articles that are like, why we all think woke beliefs are nonsense. So like, why do woke people, like, why is there this mass movement? So it's hard to balance disagreeing with somebody in a way that kind of projects them as being a reasonable person, with also offering a diagnosis at a kind of societal level or cultural level.
You have to kind of do the thing, you have to practice the thing that you're criticizing your opponents for doing, essentially, which is, hit them at their strongest point and they believe they have good intent and all of that. And if you don't, you essentially can expect the same sort of backlash as to like what they see.
Yeah.
Like you're saying with Trump in 2016, it'll be the same result.
Yeah. I think the way that I try to manage it is that basically, and maybe this is part and parcel of my kind of anti-institutionalism, my contrarianism about groups, things like that. I basically think of like addressing broad social movements or institutions as like a different kind of project than addressing individuals, right? In a way that maybe is pathological and is itself maybe not completely rational. Maybe if people watch the end of this, they'll have some opinions about whether it actually makes sense that I do things this way. But basically, if I'm talking about an institution or about a group of people or about a social movement writ broadly, I view it as okay to think about like the background dynamics that could lead to these beliefs happening, rather than only thinking about kind of the content of the beliefs and what could like what it would look like to disagree reasonably. And when I'm dealing with an individual on a one-to-one level, that's when I think you should never say like you are just a grifter or like you are just virtue signaling, right? Among other reasons, like why even have the conversation at that point? So I think the way I manage it is by treating individuals and groups just like in fundamentally different ways. And I don't know if that even makes sense to do.
I was going to say,
kind of like the way I do it.
No, it does, and I try to do the same thing. But then you think optically, we have to convince ourselves it matters, because like ultimately our goal is to improve the discourse in some way. But at the same time, it's like we know people attach themselves to their group identity and the institutions they follow, the sources they follow. So it's like, it's similar to me. I talk to my wife about this all the time. Like I'll try to couch, not all the time, but like I'll often try to couch like posts I'll do on my personal Facebook, which is also like people from my hometown who are much more right leaning. I'll try to couch it, in a way where I'm like doing what you're saying, making more kind of broad brush systemic takes and not like individual attacks. But people, at least most times, not all times, but most times, people they attach themselves to those things. It's like if you criticize something the Trump administration does, people think, you're criticizing them because they love Trump, but it's like, people it's so difficult to navigate, but it's not futile. I do agree with you that there's a utility in practicing that.
Yeah, I think there's a utility, but it's also, kind of like you said, you kind of have to have a suspension of disbelief to do it, right? Because that the reason that groups have these dynamics is because individuals attach themselves to groups in this way. Groups just are, conglomerates of individuals. If all the individuals were rational and were worth disagreeing with in a reasonable way, then the groups would not look the way that they do, and the institutions would not look the way. Yeah. So there must be some point at which something goes wrong. So it can't be that, like, intellectually speaking, this division of labor is like completely responsible. I think it's like a good heuristic for how to do two fundamentally different kinds of thinking. But yeah, I think if you believe that, like, as I do, that to a certain extent, like, virtue signaling is a way of understanding what's happening at the group level, of like woke people, then I must believe, to be rational, like to be consistent, I must think that at least some individuals are doing virtue signaling, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would never use it as a way of like stopping debate with individuals, but it's just, you have to think that somebody is being irrational in that way if you think that the group works that way.
And you can usually,
sorry, I was just like working this out in front of you.
You're totally good. I have to work through it too. I mean, you can usually, not all the time, but my measurement usually is how the conversation starts to break down if you're being polite and engaging honestly, and then the other person starts to get defensive, angry at the honest engagement. You can usually tell pretty quickly if this is something that, that they're actually approaching in good faith, or if it was just kind of like a flavor of the week thing that they threw out and they weren't expecting to engage at like a meta level or whatever. Because most people, but that's even difficult because most people aren't ready to do that, even if they do sincerely fully believe the thing. So it's tough. But
I've caught myself doing that too, like, because I have such a variety of followers, every now and then I'll tweet like some joke or something, and one of my like more woke, or at least like anti woke followers will be like, well, hey, like, don't you think that it's actually like this? And like the first thought will be like, hey, like, I'm doing a little signaling here, right? Like, there's a little red meat for my people, let me get a little, let me play the game a little bit. Yeah, I'm not proud of it, but I've definitely done that. And I feel like I've kind of like irked friends by like trying to have a real conversation with them when they were doing that too.
You gotta have fun sometimes, and like, you're not always gonna meet people like perfectly. Sometimes you wanting to troll a little bit, and someone else is gonna be.
That's the other thing. I think for me, the best relationships I have across lines, one thing that characterizes them is there's this feeling of like, we'll try again tomorrow. They don't catastrophize if there's a breakdown in communication, or if they're just like, you're just not getting it, you're just not getting this one, you're just like, well, okay, next time we'll do better.
Let's take a step back. We don't have to cancel each other.
Yeah, and I think that is something that there are a lot of people. I'm lucky that I've formed a large enough group of people on Twitter that there is quite a few people who I have faith that if I do something that they think is just ridiculous, we'll be able to do that.
Yeah.
But not everybody. And it is core. I think it does go along with who I think the smarter people are, but only to an extent. There are some smart people who are not tolerant in that way, let's say.
Well, Twitter is a funny place for that, for intelligent people in general. I think it has a funny way of making smart people look dumb and dumb people look smart, depending on how you understand the language and the culture. So it's tough. But.
Yeah, I basically agree with that.
Yeah, this has been great, man.
This has been a lot of fun. I like I said before, some of this stuff I hadn't really thought about in detail before, so I was kind of working through some of it as we were talking. So
me too. It's good to tease out, and I think it's like the space that we occupy is complicated, and there's not a lot of meta analysis out there. At the broad, there's a lot of like individual blogs and takes and whatnot, but it's nice to be able to talk it out. So I really appreciate you coming on for this. Do you have anything you want to plug or anything you got coming up that you want
to? Gosh, a lot of the things I'm writing these days are kind of like, for some reason I got myself into a round of like problematic things. The last thing that I had published,
getting you in trouble.
Yeah, exactly. The last thing that I had published was this thing about why people shouldn't be like too intense about the name critical race theory. You know,
Right.
like people vaguely know what we're talking about, and like, you know, let's like talk about the substance of it, which is kind of like, I don't know, maybe it's not right. Maybe it's not the sort of take that I would have with some other topics. I'm not 100% sure about it anymore. Then the piece I'm writing a piece about arguments that say that basically that say that like wokeness is a new religion.
Mm.
And I think these arguments are a little bit too easy to make. People make them a bit too quickly. They don't define what a religion is or anything like that. But I also, I kind of make a weird argument in the piece that's like, if you add all of them up, it's like a lot of different reasons for thinking this that people have offered kind of like individually. So once you see them all at the same time, you can kind of come up with a story on which the religion, you know, appellation or whatever you want, epithet or whatever you want to call it,
Right.
kind of makes sense as something to attach to it. So we'll see if that ends up being accepted, if that comes out. And yeah, the big thing that I mentioned, I have this like relatively academic thing I'm writing. Well, it's very it has like 100 footnotes already, or something, on the nature of political beliefs. So it's a book project basically in epistemology, about the epistemology of politics and about what people ought to believe about politics. So that I'm going to keep working on for probably maybe 6 more months or something like that, as I teach this class in the fall. So
Great.
if people are looking for some Christmas reading, maybe I'll post it on Twitter.
some
I don't have like a
some deep
publisher or anything
academic
for it.
read. Yeah. Wait.
Yeah.
Hey, nowadays you don't necessarily need one.
Yeah, that's the funny thing.
So,
That's the other funny thing about Twitter, right? Like, I think I might just put a PDF up on my Dropbox and put it on Twitter, because like, who cares?
right.
Now, if I do it with an academic publisher, it'll get like a few dozen readers, and I don't know. It's not why I write, right? You know, like I don't write to be part of one of these little rooms. You know, I write to kind of connect people from different rooms together, I guess, or to alienate every room or something. Who knows? Who knows? I don't know.
That's a great way to cap it off.
Good way to end it. Yeah, good way to end it.
Cool. Well, again, I appreciate the time, man. It's been fun. We'll do it again sometime.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Oliver.